Okay, hello, welcome everyone. I believe we are live and we are being recorded. Okay, welcome today to this webinar. Thank you so much for joining. We are going to be diving into Scope 3 emissions in agricultural value chains, strategies for reduction of emissions within value chains, and how SustainCert's scope impact units are building trust between companies to enable scale for emission reduction collaboration. Today, we're specifically talking about the case between Nutrien Ag Solutions and Maple Leaf Foods. I'm really excited today to have both speakers from Maple Leaf and Nutrien. It's an opportunity for us to share a bit more about this unique approach to value chain decarbonization, as well as for us to just celebrate a little bit around the fact that the Nutrien program has been the first to achieve SustainCert verification in Canada and the third program to issue impact units into SustainCert's Scope 3 platform, which we call Vivid, and I'll reference that a few times throughout the webinar. I do have the pleasure today to be joined by two speakers with firsthand knowledge of this collaborative value chain program, Sally Fliss, the Director of Sustainable Ag Program Design and Outcomes Management at Nutrien, as well as Mauricio Alanis, the Director of Sustainability Strategy and Partnerships at Maple Leaf Foods. I'm also joined today by Kai Streicher, who is our SustainCert's Director of Climate Science. He is going to be joining us for the Q&A session. So if you have any technical questions around life cycle assessment, impact units, our allocation methods and systems, he's definitely here to help. I am Thomas Blackburn. I'm the Vice President of Sales and Business Development for SustainCert. I'll be your host today and leading the discussion in a few minutes with both Sally and Mauricio. So for our agenda today, first, I'll frame up the webinar with a little bit of the state of play for Scope 3 with results from some research that SustainCert conducted with companies in late 2023. And then we'll jump into a discussion with Sally and Mauricio, talking a little bit about their company's Scope 3 accounting targets and how they identified this opportunity to collaborate in their supply chains. We'll go into a little bit more about the program itself, and then why they've gone through this process of verification and issuing impact units, and then a little bit around, what does co-claiming and the co-investment model look like. We'll leave a few minutes, about 10 minutes for Q&A, and then I'll close the webinar with an overview of some of SustainCert's solutions and verification services. So a few housekeeping points while we're on this slide. Be aware the webinar is being recorded, so any contributions you make today will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel. For the Q&A session, please feel free to post any questions as we go through this discussion in the chat function. And so my colleague Leah will be monitoring that. If you're having any difficulties with that, please feel free to send us a message via the chat box. She can help. And then finally, this recording will be provided directly to those who signed up and participated, as well as posted on our YouTube channel. All right, I think that's all the housekeeping that we have for today. So just a quick reminder of SustainCert and who we are. We are an ISO accredited climate verification and certification company. We work to bring credibility to both carbon markets as well as corporate value chain greenhouse gas accounting. We were founded with the mission to scale credible climate action by bringing digital solutions to our verification services to make them more accurate, transparent, and simple. In Scope 3, in value chain emissions, the topic of our webinar today, we offer verification services for emission reductions and removals being achieved in Scope 3, as well as digital infrastructure to exchange these emission reductions and removals and the impact achieved across value chains securely and accurately on our Vivid platform. SustainCert is acting as the layer of credibility for Scope 3 to help scale collaboration and co-investment in value chain climate action. It's worth mentioning that we are also the Secretariat of the Value Change Initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder forum of practitioners. There's about 100 entities that are involved in that program. It brings together civil society, some of the world's largest companies in food, beverage, and ag, as well as apparel, and internationally recognized climate frameworks to identify practical solutions for Scope 3 accounting to scale. So that's a little bit about us. I just want to frame up a little bit of Scope 3, why we are talking about it, what's all the discussion around Scope 3, why is it a challenge for companies. So for many organizations, Scope 3 represents the highest portion of their total Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. On average, for companies, this represents around 70% of their overall emissions when you take into account Scopes 1, 2, and 3. Depending on the sector, specifically for food and beverage and ag companies, we see that average be closer to around 90%. So it's a significant portion of companies' Scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. With that, companies have been under increasing pressure to disclose their Scope 3 emissions. And so with all of the increasing regulation globally, more and more companies are actually accounting for and disclosing their Scope 3. There's pressure to get that more accurate, but then there's also pressure not just to disclose, but also to act. How do you plan to actually reduce or remove emissions in your supply chain in line with climate science to keep us on a 1.5 degree path? To date, we have around 4,000 companies committed to Science Based Targets Initiative, which is the leading authority in defining how to set a net zero or science-based target aligned with a 1.5 degree world. This requires aggressive targets for Scope 3 emissions. It requires significant reductions and removals to be achieved by 2050. And one of the things that we're finding is companies are setting science-based targets in recent years, and that reporting and setting the targets may be one thing, but taking action to actually credibly reduce those emissions is another thing. So we launched a bit of research as SustainCert to find out where are companies on Scope 3. What we found, or what we set up, was a survey of 500 large organizations across Europe and the US. We did a few in-depth interviews with some of those customers as well, looking at, how are companies reporting, how many are reporting, are they planning to report Scope 3 emissions, what sort of challenges are they experiencing when they're looking at how to reduce those emissions, and what do we need to scale credible action? Is there a role of verification in all of this? So just a quick update of what we found to frame our discussion today. Scope 3 disclosure is advancing really rapidly. 92% of the 500 that were surveyed reported that they are reporting or plan to report their Scope 3 emissions in the next 12 months. And then of those who are already reporting, we found that 99% have set a reduction target against those reports. So they either are or will very soon be taking action on their Scope 3 emissions. And then we also saw that 9 in 10 of the respondents use verification for their Scope 3 emissions reporting, just to independently verify their results. However, we did see that only half feel fully prepared for the increasing scrutiny that they're going to be facing when it comes to regulation and some of the additional requirements that are going to be placed on Scope 3. The companies also outlined a clear set of challenges when it comes to acting on those targets and reducing those emissions. The biggest challenge that we saw was just getting proper resource allocation to address Scope 3 emissions. So most companies are prioritizing Scope 1 and 2. It makes sense. Those are direct emissions that they control. And then Scope 3 are indirect emissions that they don't have control over. So, creating a plan is a challenge. What we saw is the highlighting of just that value chains are complex. Suppliers can shift. Getting information from your suppliers in a supply chain can be quite a challenge. Accurately tracking those emissions can be a challenge when you have a shifting supply chain. Getting consistent reporting from all of your suppliers can be quite difficult as well. So how do you do that, and how do you do that credibly? Additional barriers that we saw highlighted in this survey was just the overall, again, limited control of suppliers, complexity, identifying all the relevant actors. You can kind of bucket that into the first topic that we were talking about. Overall, then high costs of potentially implementing some of these programs, a lack of clear guidance on if you start investing, how are you actually going to get the benefits to show up in your Scope 3 reporting, and some of the risks of double counting, double claiming, and free riding that comes out of Scope 3. So Sally and Mauricio are here to share a few more insights on their challenges and their companies, their collaboration on Scope 3 intervention, and how SustainCert's solutions are helping them to overcome some of these barriers. I just want to take a minute to level set on some of the terms that we're using, making sure that everybody's on the same page in the webinar today. Scope 3 value chain emissions are indirect emissions not included in Scope 2 that occur in the value chain of a reporting company, including both upstream and downstream emissions. When we refer to interventions in this webinar, we're going to be talking about projects, programs, business decisions that companies are making that may result in a form of reducing or removing emissions in their supply chain. Interventions are aimed directly at achieving that, and they provide a way of measuring changes in emissions to show year-on-year progress of the changes that are being made. When we talk about impact units represent the result from verified Scope 3 interventions in a way that allows for companies to accurately allocate and co-claim the outcome throughout a value chain. One impact unit represents 1 ton of carbon reduced or removed by an intervention. Why are impact units important? Impact units can potentially mitigate the risk of free riding, double counting, and overclaiming across a value chain. They also enable the possibility to share the cost of interventions throughout a supply chain. When you make an impact in a value chain, it impacts all of the companies reporting Scope 3 in that supply chain. So this is a way to collectively tackle Scope 3 emissions in an accurate way for co-claiming. How are we doing this? Overall, impact units are being issued into a system, the Vivid platform that we have built. This represents an integrated LCA, life cycle assessment framework, to be able to track emissions across the life of a product. And then we're also asking for proof of sourcing from companies to ensure that they have the right to claim those outcomes from those interventions. So impact units can then be shared across players and allocated up and down the value chain and enable co-investment and co-claiming. Okay, now we are going to get out of me presenting and get a bit more into the conversation with Mauricio and Sally. Let's hear a little bit from our speakers. I want to start with you, Mauricio. Feel free to introduce yourself just briefly. I think one of the first questions that I have for you, just looking at the results that we had, it can be a long road to taking action on Scope 3, all the way from accounting, analyzing your emissions, outlining a plan to act. Can you tell us a little bit about Maple Leaf and its current approach to Scope 3? Are you accounting and reporting? Do you have targets? What does that look like for you today?
Sure. Thank you, Thomas, and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are, or good evening even. So Maple Leaf, well, a little bit about myself. My name is Mauricio, like you said, Thomas, Director of Sustainability Strategy and Partnerships. I lead some of our strategic projects, and I'm also the Climate Smart or Region Ag lead for Maple Leaf Foods. In terms of Maple Leaf Foods, if you don't know about us, we are a leading Canadian consumer protein company. We make high quality and innovative consumer food products under some of North America's top protein brands. So brands that you'll find at the grocery store like Maple Leaf, Schneider's, the Greenfield Natural Meat Company. We also have plant-based protein brands like Light Life and Fuel Roast. We employ about 12,000 employees, and we are vertically integrated down to animal raising. So we have about 200 hog barns in southern Manitoba, and the feed grains to feed our animals are what make up a big portion of our Scope 3 emissions. As you can imagine, Scope 3 emissions make up nearly 90% of Maple Leaf's total emissions, of which feed grains represent a big portion of those. And yes, we do account, we report, and we do have targets on all of our scopes, including Scope 3. We have a full emissions inventory consistent with the greenhouse gas protocol, and it does have a limited assurance from KPMG. And back in 2019, we set science-based targets. So we have a 30% reduction target by 2030 across all 3 scopes.
Great, thank you for that. Sally, do you want to talk a little bit about Nutrien and how you all are looking at Scope 3, your approach to how you view your role in this value chain? Mauricio's looking upstream at his emissions. How does Nutrien play a role in all this?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. I'm glad to join you all today. Sally Fliss with Nutrien Ag Solutions. And we are looking at this from many different aspects. So we are both a manufacturer and a retailer of fertilizer products, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, primary nutrients, plus products that help the use of those NP and K fertilizers work more efficiently in the field. So we operate in Canada, the US, Latin America, and Australia in our retail and wholesale and production businesses. And we employ about 28,000 people globally in our mining, manufacturing, and retail sales on the ground, about 2,800 crop consultants in North America alone, working with growers on the ground to implement practices that suit them best for the acre that they're managing and the crop that they're growing and the outcomes that they're looking for. So we really sit at that point where we can work with growers on bringing that whole acre, whole field solution and a crop plan to them to implement to achieve either emission reductions, potentially look at removals, but drive yield, be more productive per acre, use less inputs, use these products, whether biologicals or other enhanced efficiency products that can be added to crop management to make that whole acre more efficient. We sit in a very interesting spot for Scope 3. We buy a lot of fertilizer. We also sell a lot of fertilizer. And so we actually have both Category 1 and Category 11 claims around our fertilizer sales and use in the field that we have to try and tackle, which all goes back to that better use and more efficient use of every pound of fertilizer that we're working with growers to get on the field in order to produce the crops for either feeding animals or going directly into products that we buy every day.
All right, great. Mauricio, going back to you, just a quick question on, how did you go from identifying feed in your as a major source of emissions, and then how did you go about setting a target for that and then creating a plan? So go from identifying that to what is your action plan around addressing those emissions?
Sure. Great question. So, back in 2019, like I mentioned, we did set science-based targets. So as part of that initial lift to prepare for and submit our science-based targets, we had to, of course, prepare and assemble a full inventory, a full greenhouse gas inventory across all of our scopes. And in doing so, we had to, whether it was draw from LCAs or other types of inventories, to determine what the total impact was from our emissions, including feed grains. So feed grains bubbled up quickly as one of our top sources. And some of the other animal raising activities that we have from our third-party contracted growers, for example, from a hogs perspective, was also up there. So that quickly shifted into, okay, so here are our targets. How are we going to actually achieve these? And so we're working basically on the 80-20 for now, of which are the 20% of our emissions that are having 80% of the impact. So feed grains being one of those, and that's where our sort of initiatives with Nutrien came in collaborating and having that impact. As I'm sure we'll get into it more today, having scope 3 impacts is a big challenge for everyone. Everybody on the call, I'm sure, knows it requires a lot of collaboration. It requires that sort of tricky negotiating around how do we invest, who gets credit for what is going to happen, who's going to lead it, who's responsible for what, all those different things. And so, for us, having this partnership with Nutrien really helped us start to weave a path towards how are we going to tackle one of those biggest sources of emissions, which is feed grains.
Okay. And then Sally, I mean, same question for you in identifying all of the actions that you can take. How were you thinking about, how do we make this happen? Who are the partners that we can engage? How did you come together and look at downstream partners and think about who you can work with on a collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, I think mostly we're still trying to figure a lot of that out. We have a great partnership with Mauricio and a couple of other businesses that we work with on the grain handling, grain use side, but I think we're still trying to figure a lot of that out. As I mentioned, that category 11 piece is still tricky. What does the accounting look like there versus our category 1? We haven't disclosed our scope 3 footprint or any goals around it. So a lot of this for us is just being prepared for when we do that and set some goals that we have the system set up to get at those emission reductions as quickly as we possibly can. And so really it's a lot of the work for us has been figuring out what does that interaction in the field look like from a grower, crop consultant, program offer that's going to be effective to be implemented on the acre and actually drive some impact and some change and the right solution for that grower. And then working with partners like Maple Leaf to figure out how does that fit into their accounting and what does payment schedule look like and what does the commitment and timeline look like and how can we start mapping out meeting more and more of their procurement needs. When we started out in 2021, it was just, hey, let's do 40,000 acres. So we did 40,000 acres and now we're at the point of a couple times a year, Mauricio and I go through their grain procurement, what acres we're able to impact, how do we need to shift and target so that we're actually meeting as close to 100% of what they're procuring for feed in the projects that we're doing. And then where there's places that we can't do some of our nitrogen management programs because it's soybeans or peas, what are our other opportunities to do something either around removals or just different reporting or more accurate emission factors for those crops so that we can start to address 100% of that feed that they need. Because we're working on, in 2022, we did about 460,000 acres of growers enrolled in our carbon program in Canada around nitrogen management. And so we're working on more acres than what Mauricio and Maple Leaf need to source all their feed, but it's making sure we sign up acres that match their needs and not just sign up acres for the sake of signing up acres and then figuring out how can we bring other partners in on those extra acres to drive more value back down to the grower in the field.
Okay. And did you all start, where the program is now, did you all start with the same set of activities and the same assumptions around the emissions that you would be addressing between Nutrien and Maple Leaf, or has that evolved as the program has evolved as well?
It's evolved. So we started trying to look at both emission reductions and removals. Where we're working with Maple Leaf in Manitoba and Saskatchewan is, I think 100% of the growers that report as a part of the Maple Leaf reporting are no-till already. So doing a soil organic carbon practice in a dry land area that's already 20 years into no-till is really hard to figure out what's that removal going to look like. So we're still trying to figure that piece of it out. And so we've really shifted more to that emission reduction piece and how do we keep moving growers to be more and more efficient with every pound of nitrogen they're using on that acre, right? We follow that, the NERP protocol, the nitrous oxide emission reduction protocol from Alberta is what we've modified a bit in our IDD approach that we're taking with Maple Leaf and in Canada in general. And so how do we drive growers from that basic level of 4R implementation to that advanced level of where they're really doing everything they can do on that acre, digitally collecting data, in-season analysis, nitrification inhibitors if it's right, split applications, all the things that can be done in order to make the use of that pound of nitrogen most efficient and reduce emissions. So we've really kind of shifted from trying to tackle both removals and reductions to how do we just get to the most efficient nitrogen acre, and then at the same time continue exploring this removal space.
Yeah. And then Mauricio, has that had a big shift for you all and how you're thinking about your plan for reducing emissions, and how has that evolved based on some of the feedback of realities on the ground and what you're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly has been a journey for sure, as Sally very well explained, in terms of starting off the partnership with that small pilot that we had, and trying to sort of tackle both the soil organic carbon sequestration side of things as well as the emissions reduction through the NERP protocol. For us, I think it continues to be a very attractive opportunity still to reduce emissions on the farm, whether they are reductions or they are removals. I love what Sally says, that right now it's all about getting the most efficient acre while simultaneously continuing to explore what some of the other options are. So we continue to be focused on that as well.
Yeah. Sally, in the introduction, I was talking a little bit about some of the barriers to Scope 3 action: limited control over suppliers, complexity of measuring, high costs associated with carbon reduction and removals, lack of guidance, risk of double counting. Could you talk a little bit about, why you've engaged SustainCert in verification and how that helps you overcome some of these barriers, or if it does? Yeah.
I don't know if it helps us overcome, the barriers, Thomas. But it helps us over. I mean, the main thing it helps us overcome is, we're all, I'm sure, going through reporting season right now, and the level of scrutiny around the numbers and the claims and the tons of carbon associated with our programs that we're putting in our annual report and in our sustainability report are requiring more and more evidence, for lack of a better word to put around it, every single year. So that's where working with someone like SustainCert and going through that validation and verification process and being able to show that, yes, these things are real, we've been through validation and verification, here's the grower data, here's the statements from SustainCert, that has been super helpful this year. But I think all the rest, other than the cost of emission reductions, I mean, realistically, when we're going to the field with an emission reduction program for growers around improved nitrogen management, we're trying to bring them a package, a whole acre solution that's not going to cost them money. That's going to save them money at the end of the day and make them more money per acre, because we're hopefully driving yield. The plan is every time we make a change in nutrient management on that field is we're driving yield every time. So they're making more per acre, even if there's maybe an enhanced efficiency product in there that costs them a little more than in the past. We're tying that hopefully with a nitrogen rate reduction. So there's a change in that NPK purchase, and there's a yield gain, hopefully, in the whole process. So overall, we're always trying to bring something to the grower that drives profitability for that grower in the field. The removal space is hard because of soil testing, permanence, the idea of having permanence around soil organic carbon in a Scope 3 footprint that's reported and adjusted annually based on what Maple Leaf purchases, based on what we buy and sell for fertilizer, is really hard. I think everybody is challenged to wrap their head around how do we look at permanence in a system where we're reporting annually and not just once on a total footprint. But so that's a challenge there. I know timeline is a challenge. I think Nutrien, Maple Leaf, and SustainCert have all learned a lot in the process we've been through for our project in validating and verifying things, and what we need and what maybe we all need to adjust a little bit across the board to hopefully make this go faster as we bring new crop seasons into the system.
Yeah, absolutely. So for you, it's very helpful to have that sort of proof, being able to show that to Maple Leaf and see that. Maybe turning to you, Mauricio, what do those statements do for you? How are you looking at using impact units once they're issued to you, right, and shared with you?
Sure. I mean, SustainCert overall has provided us with that credible and verifiable way to report on those impacts that our co-investments are having on our shared supply chain. I do want to take a quick step back and just provide some important context for the audience around how this has played out from a co-investment sort of supply chain standpoint and
Yeah.
how, and then I'll get into your question a little bit more. But when we think about how Nutrien builds up their Scope 3 emissions inventory, and when Maple Leaf builds up our Scope 3 emissions inventory, we are each respectively having Scope 3 categories intertwined with the farm. So for us, our Category 1, Scope 3 Category 1 purchase goods and services comes from those feed grains at Maple Leaf. That's part of what we put into our Scope 3. And for Nutrien, as they build their Scope 3, their Category 11, I know, Sally, you mentioned also Category 1 from a Nutrien perspective, but where it joins up with Maple Leaf is your Category 11 use of sold products, in your case, fertilizer. Those emissions are being accounted for collectively in our respective Scope 3s. So the opportunity to be able to collaborate on a common emission source, which is the farm, is interesting, has been interesting to both parties, and this is how this all started out. But the challenge of how to report on those impacts that we're having in a verifiable, credible, and repeatable way was always a challenge. And so this is how SustainCert has helped us accomplish that via the impact units and via the work that we've done together. So verification is important to us to credibly co-claim our impacts, and then, of course, in the future, or as we've done over the past number of years, to be able to scale that impact together.
Okay, great. Maybe just, leaning into that a little bit, what does that sort of partnership and co-investment and co-claiming look like for you all? Can you talk a little bit more about your commercial relationship, how you structured this from the start? How did you get started? And it's probably formalized a little bit more over time in terms of, the expected delivery, how many tons, how many acres, things like that. Can you talk a little bit about how this is structured between you two?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about the structure, Sally, if you want to take some of the higher level sort of numbers, if you'd like, from a acres perspective. So, I mean, we've both invested now in providing outcomes-based payments to the farmers. This has evolved over the years with the partnership, as we wanted to make sure that we were always providing fair payment to the farmers. The farmers, with Nutrien's help, have always been at the center of everything. This is actually something that was very important to us at the beginning of the relationship, finding a partner that had farmers at the forefront of everything. And so as they change their practices on their field, they have a positive impact, a reduction or a removal, and that becomes the overall emissions factors for our feed grains. We then get to account for a lower emissions factor on those feed grains in our Scope 3 inventory, but given how all the timing has played out for us, transparently, we haven't yet been able to report that into our Scope 3. I was monitoring some of the questions, and I can address that in a moment. But overall, Nutrien plays the role of project developer from a commercial perspective. They are the project developers and the ones that lead the relationships with the farmers. They collect the on-farm data, they do the measurements, and do the overall agronomic support for the farmers, the practice changes, the education. Maple Leaf supports this work by supporting it financially and committing to these financial investments for the work required and the expected outcomes. Maple Leaf recognized early on that in order to have a positive impact in this space, we had to share in that transition risk that is inherent to the farmers when adopting new practices. So we've committed to be a part of that journey with them, and that's what we're continuing to do. So we've always had a transparent and collaborative commercial relationship with Nutrien, one where Maple Leaf has endeavored to become closer with the farmers as well, taking advantage of opportunities to meet with them face to face, discuss the program, how it's impacting them. And of course, we have all of the things that you would expect in a good relationship, setting up regular touch points and rhythms to ensure that we're keeping each other abreast of new developments, some of the things that Sally already mentioned in terms of looking forward, what's next, how are we evolving the project, how are we scaling it together, etc. So a little bit about the commercial relationship. Sally, if you want to take the other part of Thomas's question.
Yeah, it's a lot about balance, I think, is the best word to use? How do we balance what we need as Nutrien Ag Solutions and in our reporting, and what Maple Leaf is looking for in their reporting and outcomes? Trying to find the right stuff that works for the grower and our retail on the ground, but also works for the reporting needs that Maple Leaf wants to see downstream. Is a probably something we talk about on every call. How many tons can we yield? It's unfortunate, I think, across the board that this is all driven by tons of carbon, whether you're talking emission reductions or soil organic carbon, and not just let's do better agronomy every year and be a more efficient per acre. And how we want to make sure we weave that into our conversations, both internally and publicly and with growers of, yes, there's this outcome we can pay you for at the end of the day, but it's all about doing better agronomy on the ground and making you more productive and more profitable year over year. So it's really a lot of balance, I would go back to, of the needs across the two sides. We really operate on an acre basis. We do pay for outcomes versus paying a set price per acre for implementing specific practices. But realistically, we operate on an acre basis because it's a lot easier to count acres at the beginning of a project and during signups than to count outcomes, because you never, like, we're signing our 2024 growers up right now. We'll sign up a set number of acres for Canada, and then we won't know until August kind of what acres are going to sort out to what, between growers changing the crop they decide to plant, weather impacts, global impacts on the supply chain still around crop protection or fertilizers, and what is actually going to happen on that acre. So we always start at acres because so much can happen to a grower or a field in a crop season that's going to change what outcomes we see by the end of that growing year.
Okay. And then just digging in a little bit to what you're mentioning, you're paying for essentially not for outcome, but for practices, right?
No, we pay for outcomes. We pay for tons of emissions based on level of for practice implementation that the grower does.
Level of practice implementation. Okay.
But they manage the program overall. It's not necessarily
linked to a ton of CO2, though. Is that right? Or
it is, Ty. So we pay our 2020, for example, our 2024 program in Canada right now, we base loosely off that Canadian, I don't know exactly the term for this, Mauricio, so you might have to jump in and explain it more, that Canadian national carbon price. But we've got it booked, pay $65 a ton for emission reductions on the acre. So the grower is paid for the tons of emission reduction they can achieve on that acre through better nitrogen management. And then we use those emission factors from the nitrous oxide protocol from Alberta to determine number of tons. So the grower is a bit, and our US program set up very much the same way using the nitrogen management protocol from Climate Action Reserve. It's a little bit of more of a choose your own adventure than just do cover crops or reduce tillage, because the grower can decide, all right, well, I want to get involved, but this year I only want to do a nitrogen management plan. Maybe next year I'll add a nitrification inhibitor and digital data collection. And in the US, maybe it's this year I just want to reduce my rate by 5% and see what happens. And then next year I can add some enhanced efficiency products. So it lets the grower decide what level of practice change around nitrogen management they're comfortable with when they sign up, and we can give them an expected outcome based on their geography and those emission factors. And then at the end of the crop season, once we have all the data in, we look at, okay, what actually happened on your acre for yield, and did the practices get implemented? Did the crop you told us where you were going to plant in February actually get planted? And then figure out an outcome-based payment at the end of the season.
Okay, and then that's reflected back to you, Mauricio, right? I mean, in terms of outcome. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's right. So we have those discussions, I mean, continuing throughout the year, but specifically Q3, Q4 around sort of what was actually impacted on the ground, what happened, post-harvest, and some of those emissions outcomes, right? And so we get to then match up, again, as Sally was describing, what Maple Leaf's procurement needs were for that year in terms of how much grain did we procure, whether it's canola, wheat, barley, for our animals, and then matching that up with the acres that had obviously those grains growing on them, and what interventions were done in those acres, again, through that flow of data.
And then I think, thanks for that. I think one of the things I wanted to outline was just the sort of journey that Nutrien has been on with us over time, has been a part of the Value Change Initiative for quite a number of years, and then has actually brought forward this program for validation in 2023 and achieved that verification in early 2024 and issued those impact units. What I wanted to just get into looking at this and thinking about it, are you all looking for others to join this program? Now that you've achieved this milestone, how are you all thinking about the partnership moving forward? What does the future look like for this program? Is it scale? Do you think that that's achievable? And what does it look like for you?
So you're just as bad as I am, Thomas, when I ask people questions on the podcast. Lots of questions all in one.
Yeah.
But yes, we would love to see more partners come in. So as I mentioned earlier, that we're enrolling more acres every year than are needed to meet Maple Leaf's procurement, number one. So we have acres available with emission reductions on any crop that uses nitrogen in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and a tiny little piece of British Columbia. So that's an opportunity for other people that want to need to make that Category 1 claim on a crop grown that they're drawing from the Canadian prairies. The other opportunity is, for example, when we do Mauricio's inventory, we look at what part of that crop is Maple Leaf using to feed their hogs. So for example, canola, they use meal, they don't use oil. So we have emission reductions associated with the oil part that are there but can't be used by Maple Leaf because they're not actually feeding the oil to the hog. So we've got some of that opportunity as well to bring more partners in on the same acres as Maple Leaf is on, but definitely extra acres. I wouldn't say we're at scale. We have a pretty big acre goal for 2024 to get signed up. The data handling, data management piece is the biggest challenge of this. While validation and verification took a while to get through, now that we have that piece established, I feel like that will go faster and faster for us every year, every crop season. But the volume of data associated with getting to the calculations we need to do and demonstrating what we need to demonstrate in the verification process is a lot. And, on 460,000 acres, that takes a bit of time to get in, and what grower has what and all that kind of stuff. So that's probably our biggest obstacle in continued scaling, is just the sheer volume of data associated as we add acres.
Yeah, and I think that's where we've been looking at a little bit of how digital can help us solve some of those things, right? Yeah. Okay. Mauricio, any thoughts from you on what this looks like moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sally summarized it really well. The sort of things that I would add is just this, scaling this continues to be very interesting to us. This is part of the reason why we've continued this great partnership, and we have scaled it meaningfully every year over year. Bringing in other supply chain actors is also something that I think is great to advocate for. I know I personally advocate for that and want more supply chain actors to come in and collaborate, specifically if they are strategically sort of placed within the supply chain to be able to drive up that level of investment and therefore that level of impact as well. Taking a step back, sort of like more from a broader perspective, market-wide perspective, but also more Canadian-specific perspective. Looking forward as well, a bit of a shameless plug for the Canadian Alliance on Net Zero Agri-Food. CANZA is this collaboration of agriculture and agri-food industry that is coming together to tackle these very challenges that we just discussed today and scale climate-smart ag as well as anaerobic digestion. In the pursuit of a net zero agri-food system, Maple Leaf and Nutrien are both founding members of this alliance, and it's something that is looking to, again, broaden the scale and the impact and the collaboration across the entire agri-food supply chain for the goals that we've discussed. So,
okay, great. With that, I do want to give us a bit of time to answer some questions, unless there was anything that either of you wanted to address that we didn't cover. So just looking at some of the questions that have been submitted. Yes, one impact unit does represent 1 metric ton of CO2 reduced or removed. I think some of these questions have been answered. What is the difference between an impact unit and a credit? Kai, do you want to come in and answer this question for us?
Yeah, sure. Perfect. Thanks. Thanks, Thomas. So I already answered in the chat quickly, but basically the difference is that an impact unit is always linked to a good. So it's always linked to a value chain or what we call a supply shed. So basically, it's always linked to, you know, a product that can travel through the value chain, and it goes along with this idea that it's linked to a value chain abatement. Another difference between like a carbon credit and an impact unit is that impact units are issued at different layers in the value chain. That is because we're kind of using the theory of scope 3 that says you're responsible for emissions upstream and downstream, which means that also several partners can kind of report the same emission source that are reduced or removed, right? So that is another key difference. And then basically impact units, you can think of them as a unitized version of a lot of environmental impact, a lot of environmental attributes that are just, I usually say they are kind of the tip of the iceberg. So they're just there to, you know, enable kind of like transfers between different partners, but they have an underlying data set, which is usually mapped onto like a life cycle inventory that allows to take project data and put that into an inventory data. So that was maybe a bit a very long answer, but yeah,
no, it helps. And then I think related is another question from Olivia at South Pole, which was just asking how we allocate, is it per cow or by milk unit within the dairy sector? What does that look like as it moves through the supply chain? And I think that's a pretty quick answer.
Yeah, exactly. Also answered that one in the chat. So usually the impact units are linked to the good that really travels through the value chain. So in this case, it would be linked to the milk. And then you had a follow-up question, Olivia, on whether we need for that yield data actually primary data, or if we can use some proxy data or some average, some national averages. Usually when it comes to level 2 assurance, we need to have primary data, right? The more primary data we have, the more likely we can actually give reasonable assurance.
Okay, and then Nicholas Tell asks, Mauricio, could you explain how the impact units are accounted for in your scope 3 inventory? Is it emission factor adjustment? If so, or a net off of the inventory? Has anyone achieved reasonable assurance on their scope 3 using impact units? Yeah.
Great question. Great question. Who asked that, Nicholas? Yeah, great question. So this is a hotly discussed topic internally for us and how we can effectively do this. As a bit of context and background for us, we are in the middle of refreshing our science-based targets, and with that, obviously setting flag targets as well. So understanding the impacts of having a flag-adjusted inventory with our respective commodity pathways and sort of what deals where. But in theory, we should be able to, we haven't done this yet in scope 3, but we should be able to grab basically the impact that the interventions had. Let's say it was a 0.1 emissions factor reduction impact on a grain that had an emissions factor of 1, then we should be able to account for that emissions factor now in that grain in our inventory as a 0.9, because we have verified that the interventions effectively reduced, I'm making numbers up, effectively reduced the emissions factor of that grain by 0.1. So again, for the procured grains, that's why we're always very careful to ensure that it's always up to and including 100% of our procured grains and nothing more, because we wouldn't be able to get credit for that. And so being able to account for that in our scope 3. Have we achieved reasonable assurance? We have limited assurance from KPMG across our entire emissions inventory, but not yet with these interventions being accounted for. I think Sally alluded to it a little bit. This partnership has been great, and figuring out just how leading edge all of this stuff has been, figuring out how to account for it effectively has taken some time. How to verify it, all the great work that Sustaincer and team have done has meant that it has taken a bit more time to actually get back the verified units and what the overall impact has been. And so with that, we're sort of looking back at what impact and how the verification went for something that we did 2 years ago. So for us to include in our scope 3 today doesn't make sense. So we're waiting until next year to actually be able to do that. So a long-winded way of saying we haven't done that yet. Lots of discussion around that, and we're also eagerly awaiting things like the land sector and removal guidance draft to be published, and seeing how that will impact and how that will sort of overlay with the flag accounting and reporting and all that. So.
Yeah, thanks, Mauricio. I think it's important to also highlight the sort of speed with which the monitoring, reporting, and verification needs to happen to enable all this sort of ecosystem to take off, right? Which is fairly quickly, so that you all can go from 1 year of the action happening and into the next, reporting those emissions and the changes that happened from those programs from the previous year early in the following year, right?
Very well said
there.
Yeah.
I do think that that sort of answers a little bit of the question on the flag target. Sally, do you compete with or collaborate with a firm like Indigo Ag?
Probably a little bit of both.
Yeah.
From a pure carbon offer, we would compete with Indigo because a grower can only sign up for one carbon program on an acre at a time. From a helping growers implement what they need to do to qualify for a program, our crop consultants on the ground and agronomists can help a grower meet the goals of any carbon offer out there. I'd like to see the acres in my program versus somebody else's, but we have the tools and the technologies and the people on the ground to help a grower participate in the carbon program of their choice.
Do you have an idea of how much decarbonization has actually been achieved by the program over the last couple of years?
Not off the top of my head. And with what we've gone through with reporting, that's probably something I would say, take a look at our annual report and our sustainability reports as they come out over the next few weeks to see what we've achieved, largely, as Mauricio mentioned, on that 2021 cropping season. But it also will report in there the scale of acres that we were on in 2023, so we can start to think about the total number of tons we hope to have through verification by the end of 2024.
Yeah, I'll add to that as well. Obviously, the amount of decarbonization would be different in terms of just from a reporting standpoint. Nutrients would be much larger because their scope of the carbon program is much larger, of which Maple Leaf gets to participate in a portion of that. That portion where we have collaborated in, for us, early calculations, like I noted in my previous comments around how far we've gone to actually embedding it into our scope 3, but our early projections look to be in the 3 to 5% of a scope 3 reduction, right? So towards our 30 by 30, they would contribute basically 3 to 5 with just NERP, with just nitrous oxide or nutrient management, I should say. So we're hopeful as well that as Nutrien and team look at other interventions that can be happening on the farm, that will continue to increase as well. But it seems small at first to just say, well, it's only 3 to 5 out of 30 or out of 100 if you have a net zero target. But it is meaningful to us to be able to have this from the ag side of things, and hopefully in the future with removals and sequestration as well. So
okay. And I think one really good additional question that's just been asked, where do you see efficiency in achieving your scope 3 targets quickly? Do you see the path faster for reductions or removals?
I'm going to go with reduction.
Yeah.
While it is still a lot of data and a process to get through verification and validation, the implementation of the practice on the field, not having to do that biogeochemical modeling piece, not having to pull soil samples, not having to figure out that right target crop season. I mean, one of the discussions we get into a lot with partners is if we're looking at a crop, when do we actually need to be talking about an intervention if we're talking about soil organic carbon? And when we're talking about a cover crop, we're not talking about new interventions with a cover crop at this point until we're looking at the 2025 crop harvest, right? We've already missed that opportunity. If it didn't happen in last fall, we're not going to impact 2024 harvested crop with that. So the soil organic carbon side, the removal side gets tricky really fast for a lot of reasons. And so I like removals. It's what our crop consultants do every day with growers, is help them manage the products they're buying from us and the nitrogen they're applying better every year. So.
All right. Pretty clear answer there. Okay, we do have some additional questions. We can follow up with those after the webinar. I just want to sort of bring us home here as we only have a few minutes left. I think in summary, just hearing a little bit from some of our speakers, verified Scope 3 impact provides credibility for demonstrating achievement of Scope 3 interventions, helping claim those outcomes in inventory accounting, aligned with best practice in terms of allocation, and allows for some safeguards to be in place in the platform that we provided for co-claiming and assuring against double counting. What SustainCert offers in our Vivid platform are 3 modules. One, a module that leads you through validation and verification of your intervention in Scope 3. We also have a module called Intervention Impact that then helps you to actually manage the impact that's achieved. So the impact units get issued into Intervention Impact, allows you to share those across the supply chain, co-claim them along that life cycle assessment system, and report them. And then the impact registry is a public database of all of the projects that have gone through validation and verification with SustainCert. So I just wanted to thank our speakers for joining us today. And if you're going to leave us with one thought or call to action, maybe what would it be here at the end of our webinar based on what you've learned going through this process and where you want to go? Mauricio, Sally, you want to go first? Yeah.
Sure. So Mauricio and I were at a meeting in Toronto last fall where one of the keynote speakers talked about place and the importance of place. And place is critically important as we roll carbon or other sustainability programs out to the field. We need to understand what is the intervention that's appropriate, what intervention is going to drive change in the field, and what the growers on the ground are able to implement before we bring programs to the field or before statements or commitments are made. I know we're a little backwards on that right now, but it's really challenging for us in the position that we sit as more of a project developer and working with those growers on the ground to have that discussion after the fact of the intervention that you've selected isn't going to work or isn't your best choice or your fastest way to get to some outcomes as we bring partners into programs.
Okay, thanks. Mauricio?
Well said. I'll keep it simple. I think my call to action, and I'm assuming I'm speaking to the converts already, is more involvement and understanding around how credible co-claiming can be a part of everyone's overall decarbonization strategy. So just encouraging that involvement in this space for scalability of impact.
All right. Thanks. Well, thank you both for joining today. It's been a really great discussion. I think we had some excellent questions. Really exciting to hear about the progress that your program is making, and thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.